Okay, we'll formally open the session. And thanks to all of you in the living room of the Mencken House for joining us, and for all members of the Mencken Society and others who may have tuned in on Zoom. I'm Bob Ruger. I'm former president of the Mencken Society. Sitting in as sort of ringmaster here, we have arranged, thanks to Jim Racho, kind of a panel discussion on a subject that should be of considerable interest, I think, to every lover of Mencken, everyone who reads Mencken and enjoys, for the most part, what he wrote and had to say. And that is, I think, a question that is especially pertinent today, given the deep divisions in American political and cultural life. We don't have to enumerate those, but we do have a former president who does a pretty good imitation of Benito Mussolini at one of his late 1930s rallies, and talks about running again for office, and has developed a personality cult that is really quite effective, it seems, in the one of our two political parties. So it's all about right and left, and especially what we can understand about the current state of affairs with the American right, which leads to H.L. Mencken, because after all, Henry Mencken probably deserves rightfully to be categorized as someone who was right at center by various degrees. So it seems to me that Jim is right in calling, sorry, that's a wrong, an unfortunate choice of words. I agree with Jim that it's a good time to talk about this subject. And it is one that leads, I think, to maybe three isolated differential questions. One is where Mencken falls on the political spectrum. Secondly, how can we be so sure that we know where he falls on such a political spectrum? And finally, does it make any difference? Does it make a difference to us or to anybody who reads him? To discuss the subject, we have Jim Racho, who, as all of you know, is an established environmental and I would say also nonprofit.
Well, definitely nonprofit. That's the one thing you could say.
An advisor to nonprofits, and doesn't charge much either, I guess.
No.
And he's one of our longtime board members, a longtime member and recently board member, and has degrees from the Cornell University and University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's a York, Pennsylvania native. And we all know our president, Darrell, incumbent president, and I was interested to see that two of his works are really right on the money. One of them has to do simply H.L. Mencken and religion, or his religious times, which is an interesting concept. I confess I haven't read this book, but I should. And the other one has to do with, as he titles it, From Billy Graham to Sarah Palin, the evangelical, how did you say, betrayal of the
something like that, of American conservatism.
Of the American conservative movement. So as I understand it, Darrell is going to go first.
That's fine.
And we didn't flip a coin, but Jim so decreed, and we're
I'm a counterpuncher.
Well, Darrell, thank you for being here, and please push on.
So I'm going to use a manuscript, if that's okay, for the sake of time. Terry T. Chow titled one of the chapters of his Mencken biography, The Skeptic, "I Am My Own Party." Marion Rogers situates that quotation from Mencken in the period leading up to World War II. He believed FDR was leading the United States. Woodrow Wilson likened into another war and complained that Congress was doing nothing to stop the president. Mencken confessed that his alienation from the people and politicians was very comforting on blue days. I belong to no party. And he added, I am my own party. That is arguably the most apt way of trying to locate Mencken in America's two-party system of liberal versus conservative. It also explains why liberals and conservatives both do not try to appropriate Mencken for their purposes. From the conservative side comes the chief complaint that Mencken disbelieved in everything, including, of course, God. And here I quote one of those conservatives. Mencken influenced the whole generation of writers who celebrated his irreverent style and sought to imitate his irreverent attitude. I grew up near Baltimore reading the now defunct Evening Sun, which routinely glorified Mencken as its patron saint, making him into a kind of benign civic icon, a sort of Baltimore version of Will Rogers. He was nothing of the sort. He was a nasty piece of work, a social Darwinist and vulgar Nietzschean, a foe of most every aspect of religion, very much including its more generous aspects, a fervent opponent of Anglo-Saxon culture and an inveterate mocker of all things that common Americans held dear, end of quote. From the left comes the complaint that Mencken was a critic of democracy and therefore, in good innuendo fashion, a proto-fascist on the order of Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And here I quote from a recent Atlantic article. Conservative unease about American democracy reached its apogee with Mencken, a passionate Nietzschean, there it is again, an anti-Semite and an admirer of Kaiser Wilhelm. Mencken's fervor for Kaiser Bill, as he was known in America, may seem a mere idiosyncrasy in retrospect, but his enthusiasm exhibited many of the traits that would characterize succeeding conservative generations, above all, a disgust for supposed cultural decadence, allied to an exalted view of foreign authoritarian values that should be adopted in, or if necessary, forced upon America. Prussia, in other words, could set right what was wrong with America. And so when World War I erupted in 1914, Mencken was ecstatic. And here the writer quotes Mencken. I too, like the leaders of Germany, have grave doubts about democracy. It suddenly dawned on me, somewhat to my surprise, that the whole body of doctrine that I had been preaching was fundamentally anti-Anglo-Saxon, and that if I had any spiritual home at all, it must be in the land of my ancestors. When World War I actually started, I began forthwith to whoop for the Kaiser, and I kept up that whooping so long as there was any free speech left. That's the end of Mencken's quote from this author in the Atlantic, and I go back to the author. Indeed, Mencken did. All that was missing for him was to don a spiked helmet. Mencken wrote 2 articles for the Atlantic, in fact, about the conflict, lauding Germany's brave blonde warriors in one and in 1914, and Germany's military leadership in the other in 1917. Another essay Mencken submitted in 1915, after Germany's conquest of the United States, never ran. Shortly after the magazine received it, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania en route from New York to Liverpool. More than 100 American citizens were among the nearly 1,200 lost, end of quote. Whether either of these evaluations of Mencken, more like guilt by association, I would say, his unique outlook, whether they actually get his unique outlook about whether Mencken was a liberal or conservative, another important reminder is a chronological one. Mencken died in 1956, but was more or less without a voice after his stroke 8 years earlier. That means that Mencken was mostly asleep at the wheel on commenting on American developments in the mid-1950s, when the so-called conservative movement began. At the font of this movement was William F. Buckley Jr., the founding editor of the National Review and a rabble-rouser in Republican Party politics, such that he and his operatives played a major role in the GOP's eventual nomination of Barry Goldwater in 1964. At first discredited thanks to the landslide victory of LBJ over Goldwater, that conservative movement moderated its antics and saw success with the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. Mencken may have likely inspired some of the prose and style of Buckley's conservatives, and his own interpretation of American politics overlapped with movement conservatism. From that group have come arguments for small government that its adherents believed to be in line with the founders and the sorts of checks and balances the Constitution instituted in the federal government. Mencken himself was some version of a libertarian and regularly praised the Constitution for the restraints it placed on the national government. Granted, when Mencken invoked the charms of the Constitution, he could do so on behalf of socialists like Eugene Debs, whose doctrines Mencken also opposed. But he was also nevertheless a true believer in the, quote, old rights of the free American so carefully laid down by the Bill of Rights. That's a quote from Mencken. At the same time, Mencken engaged in some worries about American government in which conservatives regularly traffic. Quote, bit by bit, Congress and the state legislatures have invaded and nullified the rights of Americans. Our law has not kept pace with the development of our bureaucracy. There is no machinery provided for curbing its excesses, he added. End of quote. If a basic divide between conservatives and liberals today is the degree to which someone is suspicious of government or regards it highly, count Mencken among the dubious. When it came to the Civil War, Mencken may have been even further to the right than conservatives, since conservatives generally regard Abraham Lincoln positively, even as they lament the growth of the federal government. Iconoclast through and through, Mencken did not hesitate to take the venerated 16th president down a peg or two, if only because the Christians had so inflated his sanctity. Quote, there is an obvious effort to pump all his human weakness out of Lincoln and so leave him a mere moral apparition, a sort of John Wesley and the Holy Ghost, Mencken complained. He added, what could be more absurd? Lincoln, in point of fact, was a practical politician, end of quote. Mencken did the same for one of Lincoln's most famous speeches, the Gettysburg Address. Mencken wrote, it is genuinely stupendous, but let us not forget that it is oratory, not logic, beauty, not sense, unquote. For conservatives who object to the monarchical size footprint that the American presidency has occupied, Mencken's debunking of America's greatest presidents is inspiring. At the same time, Mencken gave support to those conservatives who value local or state government over the federals when he asserted that the Civil War, quote, destroyed the sovereignty of the states, i.e. the people of the states, unquote. He even claimed that the South went, quote, into battle an absolutely free people, unquote, but came out with their freedom subject to the supervision and vote of the rest of the country. If readers wondered about his mood in pointing out such political sacrilege, Mencken clarified that he took, quote, aesthetic joy in noting the fundamental nonsensicality of the Gettysburg Address, unquote. It goes without saying that Mencken's opposition to the New Deal was a great boon to American conservatives, who thought and still think that the expansion of the federal government under FDR was a major turning point in the life of the United States. Never mind that Ronald Reagan, the foremost Reagan Democrat of all, never touched the New Deal program despite his small government rhetoric. Many forget that Mencken voted for and at times complimented FDR, though it may have been damnation through faint praise. Mencken speculated that Roosevelt's grip on the American people stemmed from his appeal as a gentleman. Even so, Mencken provided ammunition for small government types when he observed the incredible power that FDR had amassed, even in his first year in the White House. Quote, the two houses can still make faces at Dr. Roosevelt, but if they tried to impose their will upon him in any major matter, he could easily beat them, unquote. As such, Roosevelt's presidency had brought the American government to, quote, the antithesis of the English system, under which Parliament is omnipotent and the king is only a false face, unquote. For that reason, Mencken called for a convention under Article 5 of the Constitution for the purpose of making Dr. Roosevelt king in name as well as in fact. To anyone who asserted that the Bill of Rights was inviolable and beyond revision by constitutional amendment, Mencken shot back that, quote, there is nothing in the Bill of Rights requiring the national government shall be Republican in form,